Welcome back to your favorite space for reflection and unraveling the past. The subconscious classroom, your trusted sanctuary after sundown. We're so grateful to have you with us again tonight. This evening, we dim the lights and slip quietly behind locked doors into the bedrooms of history's most powerful and paranoid figures. In this 7-part journey, we won't follow speeches or battles. We'll follow slippers, whispered prayers, gold-plated pistols beneath pillows. We'll explore what happened when the applause stopped and the tyrants were finally alone with their thoughts. So, you are no longer here in the now. You are standing outside a dictator's chamber, listening for the silence behind the steel. You are watching the ritual unfold. Every candle, every curtain, every reason sleep refused to come. Let us begin. Part 1, Nightfall in the Halls of Power. The world looks different at night. For most of us, the evening brings a soft unwinding, a ritual of rest, warmth, quiet. But for the rulers of empires, the conquerors, the revolutionaries, and the paranoid architects of power, night is not always a relief. For them, sleep is never just sleep. It's a negotiation, a surrender, and for the most dangerous men and women in history, even that felt like giving too much. In this dimly lit journey through time, we won't follow battle maps or political decrees. We'll follow slippers, candlelight, and the strange, obsessive preparations that dictators made to control not just their people, but their dreams. Because as it turns out, bedtime is political too. Take Joseph Stalin. At the height of his rule, the Soviet leader lived in a world of silence and shadows. Sleep for Stalin was not a routine, it was a form of warfare. He believed that the smallest noise could shatter his concentration and leave him vulnerable. His bedroom was sealed off like a bunker. The windows were fitted with heavy blackout curtains, thicker than military canvas, ensuring not a single shaft of moonlight could enter. There were no clocks on the wall, no radio. The air was stale and still. Guards were posted outside the room, instructed not to speak, cough, or even move if they could avoid it. Stalin did not want peace. He wanted control, even of the silence. And when he finally lay down, it was often at odd hours. Stalin had a habit of keeping everyone on edge by staying awake deep into the night, then rising in the late morning. His sleep schedule wasn't just preference, it was power. If his aides never knew when he'd summon them, they were always prepared and always afraid. Compare that to Adolf Hitler. While Stalin buried himself in blackout rooms, Hitler's nights were filled with grandiosity. At his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, the Berghof, he ended most evenings with music. But not just any music. Wagner, dramatic, nationalistic, myth-soaked opera that flooded the room with sweeping melancholy. His favorite was Tristan und Isolde, which he believed perfectly reflected the tragedy of existence. Visitors noted that Hitler would often stare into the distance as the music played, seemingly lost in some imagined destiny. But music wasn't enough. Hitler also followed a strict bedtime diet: warm herbal tea, plain cheese, a boiled potato, and a biscuit with honey, all bland, all calming, all designed to prevent indigestion. He feared heartburn more than assassination. His doctors encouraged a regular sleep schedule, but he rarely followed it. Like many rulers who fancied themselves chosen by history, Hitler often worked through the night. He believed that his most inspired ideas came between 1 and 3 a.m., the witching hour of dictators. Then there was Catherine the Great. Unlike the grim austerity of her 20th century counterparts, Catherine's sleep ritual was deeply sensual. Her bedchamber was said to glow with candlelight reflected in gilded mirrors, warmed by crackling hearths, and scented with powerful herbal mixtures. Chief among them, lavender. Each night, Her maids prepared a bath infused with bundles of fresh lavender buds and oils imported from France. Catherine believed lavender had the power to soothe not just the body, but the soul. She called these her philosopher's baths, and she took them seriously, sometimes soaking for an hour or more while reading essays on law, philosophy, or satire. But the luxury masked unease. Russia in the 18th century was a cauldron of intrigue. Catherine feared betrayal from within her court far more than uprisings from the countryside. Her nights were often disturbed, not by bad dreams, but by knocks on the door, secret letters, and whispers from advisors who thought danger was near. Her scented sheets may have smelled like flowers, but the air she breathed was full of tension. So what do these very different people, Stalin, Hitler, Catherine, have in common? They all viewed sleep not as a passive necessity, but as a contested space. Sleep was a threshold, place where control slipped, and in their minds, what lived in that darkness could be just as dangerous as any political rival. Napoleon understood this too. During his years in exile on St. Helena, he maintained a strict bedtime routine, even when surrounded by ocean and memory. He would walk his garden path for an hour at dusk, speaking to no one. He refused help dressing. He burned incense and demanded silence. His journals from that time show a man desperate to recreate the rituals of command, even when no one was listening. He had lost his empire, but not his need for mastery over the night. In contrast, Benito Mussolini, ever the performer, tried to convince his followers that he barely needed sleep at all. He claimed to operate on 4 hours a night, occasionally catching naps between state events. But his staff knew otherwise. He kept a private room, heavily guarded, where he slept under sheets embroidered with Roman laurel wreaths. He surrounded himself with relics of Roman emperors, tiny busts, miniature columns, inscriptions in Latin. Mussolini didn't just rest, he role-played history. He didn't just sleep, he staged himself as timeless. This obsession with imagery extended to his dreams. He was terrified of weakness appearing in sleep. One doctor reported that Mussolini had recurring nightmares about being pulled into the sea. No shore, no ships, only water. And so, in the final hours before bed, he insisted on dry surroundings.
No fountains, no damp fabrics.
No water in sight, as if reality could hold the dream back. And then there's the case of Saddam Hussein. In his Baghdad palaces, Saddam maintained multiple bedrooms, rotating between them at random. He didn't trust any one space for too long. Some rooms were lavish, others shockingly sparse. Some nights he slept under chandeliers. Other nights he slept on a military cot in a windowless interior chamber. His goal wasn't comfort, it was uncertainty. No one could know where he would be. Not his guards, not his wives, not his enemies. But even the most brutal rulers sought comfort somewhere. Saddam's nightstand always included a copy of the Quran, a small green lamp, and a revolver. Sometimes he listened to traditional Iraqi music on cassette tapes. It was the soundtrack of a boyhood long gone, and maybe in those moments he remembered who he had been, before the palaces, the propaganda, the fear. This blend of power and vulnerability ran deep. Because while all of these figures projected strength during the day, at night their habits became strangely intimate. They feared betrayal, they feared illness, they feared the dark, and yet they also needed ritual deeply. Repetition gave them stability. The same tea, the same song, the same pacing path, the same number of steps from the door to the bed. Because when you rule the world, the only thing you can really control is the square of mattress beneath your back. Of course, not all routines were dramatic. Some were simply strange. Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator, was obsessed with temperature. He believed that most illness came from humidity, so he had custom machines built to monitor and adjust the air in his room to an exact specification. He slept in long-sleeved pajamas even in summer, and insisted the sheets be replaced daily, no matter where he traveled. His body had to be clean, the room had to be pure, the sleep had to be perfect. Why? Because power is fragile when it's unconscious. To rule is to believe you are indispensable, and to sleep is to risk discovering that the world turns without you, that the gears grind on, that the people breathe, that history forgets. So they designed their bedrooms like fortresses. They treated their rituals like policy. They held onto the night like it was a crown. And in doing so, they revealed more than they meant to. Their bedtime routines were not just about rest. They were confessions. In part 2, we'll examine how paranoia, surveillance, and control seeped into their nighttime environments, from secret tunnels and soundproof chambers to bedtime interrogations, sedatives, and dreams they tried to manipulate. Part 2, beds built like bunkers and traps. A normal bedroom is a sanctuary. For most people, it's the safest place in the world. A place to exhale, to shut the door, and let the day dissolve. But for dictators, bedrooms were anything but restful. They were strategic assets.
Vulnérable zone.
Quiet stages where the stakes remained high, and the enemy, real or imagined, was never far away. And so, many of the world's most feared rulers didn't just design bedrooms. They engineered them like fortresses. Start with the shape of the room. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin had his quarters at the Kuntsivo dacha outside Moscow rebuilt multiple times. Not because of decoration or style, but because of line of sight. Stalin feared assassination by sniper, so he had bulletproof glass installed and rearranged the room layout to prevent any clear angle to his bed from a distance. The bed itself was placed in an off-center corner, not against any wall with windows. The walls were reinforced with lead-lined concrete. Soundproofing was triple thick.
No clacks, no ticking.
Nothing to measure how long you'd been in the silence. He would sometimes sleep in one of 3 rooms, and no one besides Stalin himself knew which room he'd use on any given night. The other 2 beds were carefully made, and guards were posted as if he were inside each one. It wasn't about sleep. It was about psychological misdirection. Elsewhere, Saddam Hussein mastered this tactic. At the height of his power, Saddam rotated between multiple palaces across Iraq. But even within each palace, he slept in a different room every night. Some rooms were luxurious, others sparse and cold. The point was to confuse everyone, staff, security, family. Only 1 or 2 aides ever knew where he'd be, and even that rotated weekly. There are stories of decoy bedrooms filled with fresh clothes, cigarette trays, water pitchers, and even staged toothbrushes. Everything made to look recently used. These were often checked by loyal guards, some of whom were themselves being watched. The entire architecture of sleep became a kind of theater of uncertainty. But beneath the surface, it was fear, pure, constant fear. Dictators did not fear monsters under the bed. They feared betrayal, poison, mutiny, a bullet at 3 a.m., and so they constructed their evenings as one might build a vault. In East Germany, Erich Honecker, the head of the German Democratic Republic, was so obsessed with monitoring threats that his state security service, the Stasi, developed what they called smell jars. These jars were used to catalog the scents of suspected dissidents. Before bed, Honecker would review surveillance reports. Lists of who had visited whom, who had paused too long at a corner, who looked anxious near a wall. This was not preparation for a speech or policy. It was a form of bedtime control, a mental sedative. If he knew what the people were doing, perhaps he could sleep. Hitler, for all his theatricality, shared the same fear. His personal quarters at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin were designed with no direct corridors. You had to pass through at least 3 guarded, windowless rooms to reach him. Hallways were built with intentional blind spots. Surveillance was constant. At night, he often asked his valet to leave the hallway doors open, but with the lights off. That way, he could listen, hear footsteps, sense motion, and if he didn't hear anything, that silence told him the world was under control. He would sometimes repeat aloud, "Nothing outside, all is still." Stillness was power. But when stillness couldn't be guaranteed, there were other tools, pharmaceutical ones. Dictators turned to sedatives not always to sleep, but to keep a rhythm that matched their image. Francisco Franco, for instance, developed insomnia during the Spanish Civil War. The stress, the sound of gunfire in his memory, the tension of waiting for news, it all made traditional rest impossible. So he was prescribed a cocktail of herbal extracts and opium derivatives, taken in warm milk each night. His physician wrote that Franco needed sleep as a general sharpens a blade, but that he never fully trusted his own dreams. Dreams were often the enemy. In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu reportedly demanded that his dreams be interpreted each morning by a personal aide. He believed that certain symbols, falling staircases, lost shoes, white animals, were omens. If he dreamt of a storm, he postponed speeches. If he dreamt of flowers, he increased his security. There were even rumors that he altered food intake and sleep posture to influence dreams. No red meat before bed. No left side sleeping. He instructed staff to keep the temperature precisely 18 degrees Celsius. Too warm, he said, brings fever. Too cold brings fear. Fear was the common thread, because while the rest of the world might imagine sleep as escape, these figures saw it as exposure. And so they did everything they could to remain armored in the dark. The architecture of their bedrooms reflected that. Look closely at their blueprints and you'll notice patterns. Beds positioned against interior walls, never under windows. Multiple doors, one to enter, one to escape. Panic buttons under pillows. Revolvers in bedside drawers. Smoke detectors retrofitted as audio surveillance monitors, not for their enemies but for their guards. Some even installed trapdoors. In Chile, under Augusto Pinochet, it was said that his presidential residence included a hidden crawlspace beneath his bedroom floor. The room above was modest, hard bed, wool blankets, a wooden crucifix, but beneath it was a stone tunnel connected to the Ministry of Defense. It wasn't just an escape route, it was a statement. No matter how intimate the space, power remained close at hand. And in North Korea, the legacy continued. Kim Il-sung's palace was designed with mirrored rooms, exact replicas of each other down to the upholstery, light fixtures, and bedspreads. He could move from one to another at will, changing sleeping quarters nightly. Only his closest bodyguards knew the full layout, and even they were rotated. The palace had layers like an onion. Outer zones for staff, inner zones for family, and the core, a protected, silent bedroom, hidden in darkness. But it wasn't just the layout. It was the routine. Every object mattered. Mussolini kept his Roman busts by his bed. Catherine the Great had books stacked on her nightstand, their edges lined with silk. Stalin had 2 identical pairs of pajamas, pressed each night but never worn twice in a row. Saddam Hussein had Quranic verses carved into the walls of his sleeping chambers, not just written, but embedded. And Hitler had portraits of King Frederick the Great near his pillow, staring silently down. These weren't just quirks, they were talismans, reminders of who they were, what they had built, and what they feared losing. Even sleep became a test of loyalty. In Mao Zedong's final years, his staff included sleep watchers, attendants whose only job was to sit near his quarters and listen. If his breathing changed, they were to notify a physician. If he stirred for too long, they were to prepare tea. No one was to speak. No one was to leave their post. The irony? Mao himself often slept during the day and worked at night. But he demanded that the watchers remain on schedule, even when he did not. In this world, night never really meant rest. It meant alertness, anticipation, a practiced descent into something close to stillness, but never full surrender. Because to sleep fully, to truly let go, was to risk losing the one thing they had fought to protect with every wall, every guard, every midnight decision: the illusion of control. And so they constructed mazes in their own homes. They ritualized their bedtime habits until they resembled statecraft. They blurred the line between rest and defense. They turned bedrooms into battlegrounds. And what's perhaps most haunting is that in all of this noise, the rituals, the guards, the layout, there was rarely anyone else. No friends, no confidants, just a dictator, a bed, a chamber built like a vault, and silence. Part 3: Soundproof silence, scented nightmares, and sleep propaganda. What do you hear when you're the most powerful person in a nation, maybe the world, and you lie down at night? The answer for many dictators was as little as possible. Because silence wasn't just peaceful, it was a shield. And like everything else in their world, it had to be engineered. In Stalin's chambers at the Kuncevo dacha, silence was manufactured like steel. Walls were lined with sound-absorbing materials. Rugs thick enough to swallow footsteps stretched across the floor. The door frame was built with a rubberized seal. Even the door click was softened. If a servant dropped a teacup 2 rooms over, it was never heard. If a guard sneezed, he'd be reassigned. Or worse, the silence had a psychological function. Stalin believed that noise was unpredictability, and unpredictability was weakness. In his world, stillness was power. Even sleep had to obey. But not every dictator feared noise. Some embraced it on their terms. At the Berghof, Hitler closed his evenings not in silence, but in swelling symphony. Wagner's operas were the lullabies of the Third Reich. Not soft, not subtle, but grand, emotional, mythic. Hitler believed these compositions, especially Tristan und Isolde and Götterdämmerung, reflected the epic destiny of the German people. So he let them pour through the speakers in his personal salon before bed, sometimes for hours. Guests were expected to sit silently, not discuss, not smile, just listen. And when the music ended, Hitler would rise slowly, sometimes without a word, and retreat to his chamber, a theatrical exit, a dictator's version of good night. Elsewhere, scent ruled the sleep domain. Catherine the Great turned her rooms into lavender fortresses, not just in baths or perfumes, but in oils soaked into the walls. She believed lavender calmed the nervous system and kept her thoughts sharp. Physicians of her day claimed that too much sleep dulled a ruler's faculties. Catherine disagreed. She treated sleep as sacred, and the scents around her as its gatekeepers. She wasn't alone. In the Middle East, Ottoman sultans often burned oud wood or rose incense as a form of mental cleansing before bed. The smell wasn't for pleasure, it was spiritual hygiene. Some believed these scents banished evil thoughts, repelled disease, and even warded off betrayal. In Cuba, Fidel Castro preferred citrus and tobacco smoke. Every evening, he'd light a specially prepared cigar, not to inhale, but to let it burn beside him while he read in bed. The scent filled the room like a ward against outside air. Some of his staff claimed he only fell asleep once the smoke curled to the far end of the chamber. If it didn't, he'd get up and relight it. He wasn't paranoid about death. He was paranoid about air. But scent and sound weren't the only senses under control. Light, too, was an obsession. Most dictators feared brightness. In their minds, illumination meant exposure. So they slept in custom-designed darkness. Hitler's windows had thick velvet drapes. Franco's bedroom in El Pardo Palace had no exterior windows at all. The only light came from one ceiling fixture, filtered through a red-tinted globe. Mao Zedong, by contrast, preferred a low amber light, left on all night. He claimed it helped him think. It also made him less vulnerable, since no guard could say, "He was asleep when I entered." That mattered more than you'd think, because the boundaries between sleep and surveillance were paper-thin. Many authoritarian leaders had assistants, loyal, silent, trained, whose job was to monitor their sleep patterns. Some sat outside the room, others in adjoining chambers. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung's staff kept a written log of his movements through the night. When he turned over, when he coughed, when he stood up to urinate. One guard reported, years later, that even Kim's sleep habits were politicized. If he stayed awake past midnight, the man said, "We told people he was too devoted to sleep." The bedtime stories of dictators were never just stories. They were state narratives. This extended into the control of dreams. It sounds absurd, but many of history's strongmen believed dreams could be influenced or manipulated. Ceausescu in Romania reportedly consulted astrologers and sleep specialists to control what he saw in the night. He adjusted room temperature, banned certain foods, avoided looking at specific colors. He believed a dream of falling meant a coup. A dream of water meant internal descent. A dream of fire meant health problems. And so, before sleep, his staff arranged the room to prevent such visions. No red, no blue, no art depicting movement. Dreams were not relaxation, they were threats. In ancient China, the emperors of the Tang dynasty employed dream scribes, officials who recorded their rulers' visions each morning and interpreted them for signs of divine favor or rebellion. The practice persisted in secret in some modern regimes. Even in the 20th century, fragments of this logic survived. Mussolini once claimed that his prophetic instincts came to him not in dreams, but in the hour before sleep. So he engineered that hour like a theater set. Bronze statues of Caesar, laurel-scented oil on the wrists, classical texts near the bed. Everything designed to conjure greatness, and nothing that might suggest doubt. In Chile, Pinochet kept a dream diary during the height of his crackdown on dissidents. Historians who have reviewed it describe pages filled with cryptic metaphors. Sinking ships, locked doors, a hand knocking from the inside of a wall. Whether he believed in prophecy or was simply trying to find meaning in the darkness is unclear. But one thing is clear: for dictators, even the unconscious mind had to be watched. Of course, there's a kind of poetry in all of this. These men, who ruled nations, commanded armies, bent history to their will, were powerless before their own brains after dusk. And so they fought back with incense, silence, music, color, temperature, and spatial control. And sometimes with medication. As insomnia became more common, so did sleeping aids. Stalin drank diluted vinegar water to lower his body temperature. Franco used laudanum drops. Hitler was administered barbiturates by his personal physician. Mao used herbs ground into tea and drank just enough rice wine to cloud the edges of his consciousness. But even the pills were political. No one wanted to be seen needing help. Power, after all, was supposed to sleep naturally, effortlessly, but it never did. Not truly, because if a dictator woke in the night, the entire building often had to wake too. Lights flicked on. Guards stood at attention. Meals were prepared. Typewriters clacked. Entire policy decisions were made in that half hour between 2:15 and 2:45 a.m. because the leader couldn't sleep. And so insomnia echoed through the bureaucracy. Because if the dictator was awake, the nation must not rest. Even now, it's eerie to walk the halls of some of these former palaces and bedrooms. They're preserved in waxy silence. Sheets folded, books on nightstands, soundproof walls, dictation pads beside the bed. The scent of lavender still lingers faintly in Catherine's rooms. The floor of Stalin's dacha still creaks in the same place it always did, unless someone walks silently. And though the beds are empty now, you can still feel what they meant. These were not resting places. They were control rooms. Control over the senses. Control over perception. Part 4: Loneliness, Delusion, and the Politics of Sleep. By day, the dictator is surrounded. Staff, generals, photographers, secretaries. Applause, orders, headlines. But at night, the crowd thins. The guards retreat. The speeches stop. And something inevitable, quiet, and difficult rises to the surface. Solitude. For the strongmen of history, this solitude wasn't always welcome. It had to be padded, softened, disguised. And so many built elaborate rituals, not just for sleep, but to fend off the ghost of aloneness. Some used company. Francisco Franco, during his reign in Spain, often kept the radio on at low volume as he fell asleep. Not for news, for noise. He once told an aide, "As long as a voice is speaking, I feel remembered." The programming didn't matter. It was the illusion that someone, somewhere, was still awake with him. Even in marriage, many dictators maintained a strange distance at night. Franco often slept separately from his wife. So did Stalin. So did Mao. In the palaces of Pyongyang, Kim Jong-il reportedly avoided sleeping in the same bed 2 nights in a row, even when he wasn't traveling. He had over a dozen private rooms across several buildings, each one minimally used, each one curated for a different state of mind. Some had televisions. Others had incense. One had nothing but a portrait of his father, Kim Il-sung, above the bed. When asked which one he preferred, he responded, "None. That's the point." It wasn't intimacy they avoided, it was being known. Because to be known is to be vulnerable. And at night, vulnerability echoes. Some turned to mirrors. Benito Mussolini had multiple mirrors installed at the foot of his bed. Not for grooming, but for observation. He believed the mirror would teach a man how he looks when unconscious. A strange form of self-surveillance. The dictator becomes both sleeper and watcher. In Nazi Germany, Himmler, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, reportedly took nightly walks alone before bed, reciting passages from medieval texts. Then, once indoors, he would speak to portraits of Germanic knights hung above his bed. Not in madness, in ritual. He believed they were listening, judging him, approving him, and after that he could sleep. These were not gestures of comfort. They were acts of insulation, delusion shaped like devotion. Many had obsessions with who was nearby during their most private hours. Stalin never trusted his physicians. He distrusted medications and often forced doctors to prove their loyalty in bizarre ways. Tasting ointments, reciting party doctrine. sleeping in the room adjacent to his, separated only by a listening pipe. The idea was that if something went wrong, someone would know, and someone would be guilty. Sleep surveillance wasn't about safety. It was about blame. But surveillance worked both ways. Dictators also watched others while preparing for sleep. Saddam Hussein famously kept tapes of his own speeches playing as background noise in his room. Not because he liked his voice, but because it reminded him what others heard when he spoke. The power of playback. He wasn't listening to content. He was listening to impact. And that same obsession with image extended to how they were seen at rest. Photographs of sleeping leaders are almost non-existent. Why? Because sleep implied humanity, weakness. It was difficult to frame propaganda around a snoring figure with rumpled sheets. And so, even their beds were curated, always made, never used in public. In Stalin's guest house, the bed was remade at sunrise, regardless of whether he had used it. Sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. It had to appear untouched, regal, permanent. The bedroom was not just a private space. It was a statement. This extended to bedtime garments, too. Hitler wore tailored, high-collared nightshirts, buttoned to the throat. No slippers, no robes. His aides said it looked like a uniform. Mussolini preferred wool pajamas with gold thread initials. Catherine the Great had custom silk gowns designed in the French court style, monogrammed, perfumed, folded by hand every evening. Even their rest had to be dressed for. And when rest didn't come, then came the pills. Night after night, the great figures of the 20th century relied on chemical assistance to descend into sleep. Hitler's physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, kept a rotating cocktail of sedatives, anti-flatulence, and barbiturates. Mao Zedong, who famously napped in daylight and prowled halls at 3 a.m., used traditional herbs mixed with liquor to dull his senses. Mussolini favored bromide drops. Stalin's aides once claimed he would take a shot of vinegar-laced water to burn the brain quiet. None of it truly worked, because sleep for these men was not a health condition, it was a threat landscape. Even the dreams, if remembered, were seen as hostile, as evidence, which is why so many kept dream journals. Yes, even that. Pinochet in Chile, Ceausescu in Romania, Castro in Cuba, all recorded their dreams in some way, sometimes in words, sometimes in symbols. In Cuba, Castro reportedly had a private code for his dream entries, a system of dots and slashes that only his most trusted aide could interpret. If a dream showed betrayal, extra security was summoned. If a dream hinted at luck, an announcement might follow. Sleep became another layer of administration, one more area to govern. But even in this madness, something recognizably human breaks through. A dictator sits in his bed, surrounded by silence, breathing shallow, watching shadows on the ceiling. The roar of the crowd is gone. The flags are folded. The radio is off. And in that moment, stripped of theater, what remains? Someone afraid of being alone. Someone who doesn't know who to trust. Someone who might wake up and find the world changed without them. The bedtime routines of dictators are so fascinating not just because they're strange, but because they expose the fault lines under power. Beneath the medals, the lies, the speeches, the monuments, there is a person trying, like anyone else, to fall asleep. But unlike anyone else, they've constructed an entire world to avoid feeling human. And still, they can't. They lie awake, imagining betrayal in footfalls, hearing judgment in the radiator's hiss, smelling fear in their own sweat. They close their eyes and see faces, old allies, former enemies, forgotten friends. or worse, versions of themselves they no longer recognize. Some have nightmares, others pray, a few cry. But all of them eventually drift into the same sleep the rest of us do. Uncertain, uncontrolled, and deeply, deeply human. Part 5. The relics they slept beside. If you want to know what keeps a person up at night, look at what they keep beside the bed. For the rest of us, it might be a glass of water, a lamp, a book we've promised ourselves we'll finish. But for dictators, those isolated in marble palaces and secret bunkers, bedside tables became shrines, altars of fear,
Anchors of ego.
museum displays of the inner self. What lived beside their pillows told you everything. Start with the weapons. Joseph Stalin, even in his most secure chambers, kept a Tokarev pistol within arm's reach. It wasn't for show. In the paranoid labyrinth of Stalin's mind, sleep was an invitation to vulnerability. So the weapon was not a decoration, it was part of the bedtime ritual. Pillow, blanket, pistol, sometimes cleaned, never unloaded. Saddam Hussein took the idea further. He didn't just keep a sidearm, he slept with it. A gold-plated pistol rested beneath his pillow on most nights, wrapped in a silk handkerchief. Why silk? Because, he said, steel should never touch skin while dreaming. In a nearby drawer, within the same nightstand, was a copy of the Quran, an aging photograph of his mother, and a vial of perfume he dabbed onto the insides of his wrists before closing his eyes. The contrast was jarring. Violence and memory, God and scent, all within a hand's reach. Mussolini's nightstand was cluttered. In addition to a loaded revolver and 2 sets of reading glasses, he kept a bronze statue of Caesar no taller than a child's hand. Each night he would touch it once, not to pray, not even as a superstition, simply as a reminder, the ancient and the modern, empire never sleeps. Catherine the Great's table was altogether different. No weapons, no relics. Instead, an array of perfumes, lavender, bergamot, and rosewater, delicately arranged on a carved tray of ivory. Her favorite was a French blend, custom ordered from Grasse, with hints of citrus and musk. Alongside it sat her favorite books, volumes of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and a few scandalous poems she denied reading. Some nights, she lit a beeswax candle in a glass globe to soften the shadows. The candle was always blue, always scented with clove, always extinguished before midnight. For Catherine, the nightstand was a theater of refinement, the tools of a sovereign mind at rest. But not all displays were elegant. In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu reportedly kept a framed photo of himself on his bedside table. Not of his family, not of his country, of himself. The image was backlit. Aides later recalled that even when he slept, the face glowed in the room's darkness. Nearby sat a file folder with intelligence reports from the day, summaries of factory productivity, intercepted phone conversations, and notes from the Securitate. Sometimes, if he had trouble sleeping, he would read them aloud. To no one. They were lullabies made of paranoia. Mao Zedong had no photographs beside his bed. Instead, he kept poetry, his own. He wrote with a brush and kept his latest drafts on handmade paper, stacked neatly, bound with string. He would often reread them before bed. His aides said he believed his words, spoken aloud at night, gave him power over the future. Alongside them, a small clay bowl of green tea leaves and a white towel dampened with cold water.
No pillow.
Mao didn't like pillows. He believed they weakened the spine. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung's bedroom was filled with contradiction. One table, near his bed, contained a shortwave radio, a family Bible, a mint tin, and a music box that played revolutionary songs. The other table, on the opposite side, had only one object, a clock with no hands. It was a gift, according to palace lore, from a visiting dignitary who told him, "Time bends around greatness." Kim kept it as a joke, or maybe a prophecy. Time didn't matter. He was always the center. But these weren't the only things kept close. Many leaders kept talismans, objects of comfort or control. Hitler, for example, kept a small piece of cloth allegedly taken from the deathbed of Frederick the Great. Folded and sealed in a pocket-sized case, it remained beside his bed even in the final days in his bunker. No one knows if the cloth was real, but Hitler believed it was, and that was enough. Franco, ever the meticulous organizer, kept a diary by his bed, but not for reflection. It was a ledger. He used it to track appointments, medications, and rainfall. Yes, rainfall. Franco believed barometric pressure affected his sleep. So each night, before bed, he checked the forecast and made notes. If a storm was expected, he would request a different mattress, one filled with horsehair instead of cotton. The mattress was kept in a climate-controlled chamber. He called it his weather bed. Stalin, perhaps unsurprisingly, had no books beside his bed. He read before bed, yes, but never from the bedside table. Books were kept in an adjacent chamber, where a fire always burned, and reading took place under supervision. The bedside was reserved for something else, a locked drawer. What was inside is still debated. Some say a journal. Some say photos of old allies, some alive, some purged. Some say nothing at all, just a drawer always locked, always rumored. The emptiness was part of the fear. In Chile, Augusto Pinochet kept religious items, a rosary, a crucifix, a handwritten prayer folded into a leather pouch. His aides said he prayed every night before sleep, but not aloud. In whispers, the ritual never varied. 5 Hail Marys, 1 Lord's Prayer, then silence. And on the rare nights he didn't sleep at home, he carried the crucifix in his coat pocket. Because even a dictator, apparently, fears what waits in the dark. Fidel Castro's nightstand changed frequently. He traveled light, but kept 2 items with him at all times. A notebook filled with quotes from José Martí and a flashlight. The notebook changed often, filled with revolutionary slogans, historical trivia, and fragments of speeches. The flashlight?
Pure practicality.
If the lights failed, if there was an emergency, he needed instant vision. Darkness could not be trusted. Light had to be on his terms. And in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi added spectacle. His nightstand held a gold-plated pistol, a pair of aviator sunglasses, and a framed letter from an Italian leader addressed to His Excellency, the Brotherly Guide. The sunglasses were not for wear, but to block reflections. He believed mirrors and polished surfaces could distort dreams. When he slept, every reflective object in the room was covered. Even his own eyes had to be guarded. There is something revealing in all of this. You can study a man's speeches, his monuments, his wars, but look at what he places beside his bed, and you'll find his truth, his fears, his self-mythology, the balance he tries to keep between reality and illusion. Some placed weapons close to their heads. Others placed books. Some clutched faith. Others clutched themselves. But none of them ever truly let go. Not in the dark, not even in dreams. Because power once held is hard to set down. And sleep is, in its own quiet way, a surrender. Part 6. The Sleep Keepers Behind the Curtain. Dictators don't sleep alone. Even in the most secure chambers, someone is always listening, watching, waiting, not for the sake of care, but for the sake of control. Because behind every great tyrant's bedtime routine is an invisible chorus. Guards who never blink, valets who know not to speak, aides who sense the mood by the pattern of footsteps alone. These are the sleep keepers, and for many of them, the dictator's rest was a full-time job. Let's start at the door. In Stalin's dacha, guards were rotated in unpredictable shifts, partly to confuse would-be attackers, but also to prevent familiarity. No one guard stood post too long. No one developed a pattern. Stalin believed that routine bred loyalty, but routine also bred opportunity. And so, for the men who guarded his sleep, consistency was forbidden. Inside the suite, staff moved like shadows. His personal valet, for instance, was expected to prepare tea at a precise temperature, place it on a specific spot on the table, and then leave the room before the second hand of the wall clock completed a single rotation. The tea was rarely drunk, but the ritual mattered. If the position was off, if the cup was 2 inches left instead of right, it could trigger suspicion. Or worse, accusation. It was a form of psychological choreography, and everyone had to dance. This wasn't unique to the Soviet Union. In Germany, Hitler's valet, Heinz Ling, followed a nightly routine that never varied, cleaning the Führer's pajamas, laying out the bed linens, adjusting the lighting to a dim golden hue. The curtains had to be drawn in one swift motion. The bedside table was wiped twice, and no one, not even Eva Braun, was to disturb him once he had removed his boots. The silence was sacred. The night was a stage. In Cuba, Fidel Castro surrounded himself with rotating teams of personal assistants. Each team was trained to understand his gestures. A raised finger might mean water. A slight exhale could signal "leave me." During bedtime preparation, speech was discouraged. Even shoe polishing had to happen in another room. His aides later admitted they were less employees and more stagehands, setting the scene for a nightly performance that only one man needed to believe. But what happened when the performance broke? In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu's staff recalled nights where the dictator couldn't sleep. When this happened, the entire household was alerted. Lights flicked on. Reports were summoned. Beds were stripped and remade. Food was brought, often untouched. But someone had to do something, because Ceausescu's insomnia wasn't just a personal problem, it was a political event. Aides were terrified of the dictator's wakefulness. It meant suspicion, accusation. Purges often followed sleepless nights. The logic was chilling. If he couldn't sleep, someone must be at fault. And so, night became a time of tension for the entire regime. This dynamic extended even into medical care. In China, Mao Zedong's personal physician, Dr. Li Jisue, once wrote that tending to Mao's sleep was among the most delicate parts of his job. Mao detested medical intervention. He claimed to dislike Western drugs, even while quietly using them. He also refused to sleep at set hours. He might fall asleep at 10 p.m. or 5 a.m., and he expected someone to be ready either way. Dr. Li described rooms filled with tension, assistants too afraid to whisper, guards who didn't know if they should knock. Mao could be smiling 1 minute and furious the next. His sleepiness was not predictable, and neither was his rage. In North Korea, the Kim dynasty institutionalized this silence. Kim Jong-il's personal chamber staff were selected from elite families, trained for months, and vetted constantly. They memorized sleeping positions, room temperatures, which pillow he preferred when dreaming, which scent he disliked on rainy nights. One misstep could mean exile. These staff often slept in quarters adjacent to the leaders, but they didn't sleep. They waited, in uniforms, with earpieces, eyes open, posture straight, listening for any sign of movement. It wasn't about service. It was about never being caught unaware. In Spain, Franco's household was equally strict. Maids and valets were assigned to zones and forbidden to step outside them. The bedroom was Zone 1. Entry without a direct summons was considered an act of insubordination. One story tells of a maid who entered to adjust a curtain while Franco was reading in bed. She was removed from service that evening, not because she disturbed him, but because she might have. Proximity to power did not mean safety. It meant scrutiny. But the sleep keepers weren't just anonymous workers. Sometimes they were family. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's wives were rarely allowed to sleep in the same room with him. But his sons, Uday and Qusay, often patrolled the household in their father's name, checking locks, evaluating staff, reporting suspicious behavior. Their presence made the household even more paranoid. Some staff kept personal logs, secret journals noting who worked which shift, who had spoken to whom, who had touched which door. These logs weren't official. They were protection. If a purge came, the notes could prove innocence or at least distance. But nowhere was the burden of silence heavier than in the dictators' medical staff. Many of these leaders suffered from ailments: ulcers, tremors, insomnia, high blood pressure. But no diagnosis could be written plainly. Everything had to be filtered through image management. When Hitler began experiencing chronic digestive issues, his physician downplayed them, even to Hitler himself. Prescriptions were coded, doses were diluted, the truth always a risk. When Franco's health declined, his nighttime routines were intensified. Bedtimes were adjusted, staff doubled. A priest was made available each evening in case confession was needed, but Franco never asked for him. To do so would have meant acknowledging mortality. The sleep keepers understood this. Their job was not just service, it was theater. They maintained the illusion of invincibility. They rehearsed control. They kept the night intact. And yet, they too were prisoners of it. They could not leave, could not yawn, could not age. They lived in a strange orbit, forever close to power, yet forever silent. Some stayed for decades, others vanished. Some went mad. But a few, very few, wrote down what they saw. Years later, after regimes fell, after statues crumbled, after the curtains were finally opened and the beds were stripped one last time. They described rooms that smelled like fear, linens that never wrinkled, weapons that were polished more than used, and a strange, lingering quiet. Because for all the noise of these men's lives, the speeches, the parades, the executions, night was something else entirely. It was where the myth fell silent, where the tyrant became a body in a bed, and where a nameless guard, holding his breath in the next room, wondered what kind of world he had helped build. Part 7, Nightfall, Legacy, and the Illusion of Rest. And then the lights go out. No matter the rituals, no matter the guards, the pistols, the incense, or the silence. Every night, it ended the same way. The body still, the mind hovering, and history pausing in a single breathless moment between dusk and dawn. That moment reveals everything. Because in the quiet aftermath of bedtime, stripped of speeches and uniforms and armies, even the most invincible-seeming leaders became what they always were: people, fragile, afraid, exhausted by their own myths. What we've seen over these past hours is not just strange behavior. It's the architecture of fear. Dictators do not sleep because they are content. They do not rest because they trust the world. They do not dream because their lives have become too controlled, too curated, too distant from vulnerability. They perform their own exhaustion. They stage their solitude. And the rituals we've uncovered, the lavender baths, the gold-plated pistols, the barbiturates tucked under silken pillows, were never truly for rest. They were for containment. They were attempts to package fear, to delay aging, to defy mortality, to convince the world and themselves that power could outlast sleep. But of course, it never does. Because the night always comes, the curtain always falls, and eventually even the most guarded rooms fall silent for good. Think of the beds left behind. Stalin's bed, untouched in his dacha, preserved in velvet-lined quiet. Castro's pillow, still faintly smelling of citrus and tobacco. Catherine's canopied chamber, now a museum. Hitler's bunker, sealed beneath earth and rubble. They all tried to bend time around themselves, to wrap the night in ritual, to command the darkness like they did their people. But the bed is a truth teller. It does not respond to command. It holds the weight of the body exactly as it is: no titles, no myths, no secret police. Just warmth and gravity and breath, and eventually, stillness. For many of these figures, the greatest fear wasn't assassination or rebellion. It was irrelevance, that the world would move on without them, that their name would fade, that someday, someone would look at their bed, their pajamas, their talismans, and feel nothing. And for some, that happened. Their sleep routines, once sacred, now live in footnotes, in memoirs, in storage closets of museums where tourists peek behind glass at bedsheets and slippers and wonder what all the fuss was about. But if you listen closely to the silence in those rooms, you can still feel the weight. The heaviness of power maintained in sleep. The tension of a mind that cannot shut off. The residue of someone who once controlled thousands, yet could not control a single dream. Because sleep is the great equalizer. It swallows kings and farmers, generals and children, cannot be bribed or threatened or delayed forever. And when it comes, it is not impressed by rank. That's what makes these routines so haunting. They were never just about sleep. They were attempts to escape the one truth none of them could rewrite. That in the dark they were alone, just like the rest of us. Perhaps more than the rest of us. Because while we may sleep with worries, they slept with history at their backs. Their decisions carved into lives, into landscapes, into time. And they knew it. Maybe that's why they paced so long before bed. Why they burned incense. Why they whispered to portraits. Why they never really rested. They weren't just afraid of death. They were afraid of waking up without their power, of opening their eyes to find the world changed, to find that the night, so carefully managed, had delivered a future they didn't control. And in the end, it always did. Because no matter how many bolts are on the door, how many aides wait outside, how thick the curtains or how scripted the silence, sleep comes. And when it does, it takes everything with it, carries off the crown. It smooths out the footsteps. It dims the spotlight. And it leaves behind only the soft rustle of sheets, the cooling of tea, the faint imprint of a head on a pillow. That is the bedtime legacy of dictators. Not the bunkers, not the myths, but the silence that followed. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the power go quiet. And let us leave them finally to rest.